You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have an interview episode for you. I was fortunate enough to sit down with Andrew Winans, who is the director of an upcoming off-Broadway production of Agatha Christie's The Hollow. It's running for about a week in downtown Manhattan. It actually opens one day after I'm releasing this episode on Saturday, April 13th. And it runs until April 21st. I've included a link in the notes if anyone would like to attend, if anyone is in the New York area. So I just wanted to get that out of the way up top. I will actually be attending the debut performance on Saturday, April 13th. I'm so excited. Since I am in the New York area right now, I am on tour for my novel, The Busybody. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of you on the trail. I have already made some lovely connections with listeners here in New York at the Mysterious Bookshop, and in Long Island at Theodore's Books. And in Connecticut, I went to the lovely Avon Public Library in Avon, Connecticut, as well as R.J. Julia Booksellers in Madison, Connecticut. It's been so fun meeting you all in person, and I can't wait to meet you up at Tickham's Bookshop in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I'll be in East Sandwich on Monday, the 15th. Then I'm going on up to Maine to Print, a bookstore up in Portland, Maine. And then I shall be heading to the Midwest. I'll be at Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at Gathering Volumes in Perrysburg, Ohio, and finally at the Literati Bookstore in Ann Arbor, also in Michigan. That is all happening next week from Monday, April 15th through Saturday, April 20th. Also, I should mention, when I go to Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan on Thursday, April 18th at 6:30 p.m., I am going to be having a conversation with one of the booksellers there at Schuler Books that I will be bringing to you as a live episode of the podcast. Just a little extra bit of enticement for you, should you need it. Click on the link to my website in the notes if you would like to learn more about any of those dates. It's not too late to attend any of those book events, so I'd love to see you there. Also, for all you listeners out there in the United Kingdom, I wanted to let you know that for the rest of the month of April, The Busybody is available to download on your Kindle e-reader for the low, low price of 99p. That's right, less than £1 to read my debut mystery novel. As I've mentioned, the physical paperback won't be issued in the UK until the end of this year, though there will be copies available for purchase and signature at the Agatha Christie Festival in September. But if you are an e-reader person, this is a great deal. So I just wanted to let you know about that. Go ahead and click on the link in the notes for purchasing the book in the United Kingdom, if this is of interest to you. And now let's get to the interview, which was a great opportunity to talk at length about The Hollow, both the play and the novel, which we will, of course, be thoroughly spoiling over the course of our conversation. Here goes. My guest, Andrew Winans, is an award-winning New York City-based director, choreographer, dance instructor, and performer. He is a graduate of the Boston Conservatory, where he has a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in musical theater, and he has performed all over the U.S. and abroad, including the international tour of A Chorus Line and the U.S. national tour of 42nd Street. He was the choreographer of the recent off-Broadway premiere of Mike and Mindy's Wild Weekend Jam, and he is the director of the upcoming off-Broadway production of The Hollow by Agatha Christie, which actually opens tomorrow on April 13th and will run for a little over a week at the Players Theater in New York City. He has been working on this show for a number of months now, and I'm so excited to talk to him about what it's been like putting up one of those plays based on an Agatha Christie novel that Agatha Christie wrote herself and which many Christie theater fans consider one of her very best, a bit of an unsung jewel compared especially to Witness for the Prosecution and The Mousetrap and so on. So this is very exciting, and I'm so pleased to be able to talk about The Hollow with a seasoned professional who is right in the thick of it at this very moment. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Kemper. Thanks so much for having me today. Really excited to talk to you.
So even in the extremely abbreviated rundown I just gave of your theater credits, and I could have listed a whole lot more shows, I think it's fairly obvious that you have a really strong dance and musical theater background. And I'm curious how you came to direct an Agatha Christie play that, as far as I know, does not involve any singing or dancing, though please correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes, yeah. So actually, the way this came about was when I met with the theater owner here at Players Theater, where we're putting up the show. I'm working on a production next year in the space, and they happen to be looking for a director for The Hollow. And he just asked if I was interested, and things kind of rolled from there, talking to the artistic director, and it was sort of right time, right place.
Oh, that's wonderful. So how did you first discover Christie yourself? I often ask guests on this podcast what their Christie origin story was, and I'm curious if you were a fan of Christie's books at all, or the films and television shows based on her books before you came to The Hollow, the play.
Yeah, so actually, as a kid, I started reading Agatha Christie novels at a pretty young age, maybe a little too young. But my favorite Christie novel as a kid was And Then There Were None. And I distinctly remember feeling totally fascinated by the subject matter and how specific it was and how things were jumping off the page, which actually feels similar to my experience now working on The Hollow a little bit later in life.
Yeah, well, And Then There Were None is an excellent choice for your favorite Christie. That is we've ranked every full-length Christie novel, so that's 66 novels on this podcast. That was kind of the raison d'etre of the podcast in the beginning, even though we've now gone past that. And Then There Were None is number 2. Actually, out of 66. So yes, I mean, one of the Christie crown jewels for sure. And The Hollow, actually, the text itself is in our top 10. It's, I think, an excellent Christie. And I actually have to ask, because I think the answer is really interesting, whether it's a yes or a no. So there's no right answer here, but have you read the book, The Hollow, which the play is based on?
I'm so glad you're asking this question. So I really debated it before I started diving into pre-production on the play, before we started rehearsals. And I actually decided against reading the novel before working on the play. And the reason is I didn't want to develop any preconceived judgments or notions that weren't in the text of the play based off of the book. But I know a lot of people would approach it differently, that more information is better than less information. But I actually chose to just focus on the text in the play.
I mean, it's why I said there's no right answer, because I think it's absolutely defensible to not read the book, because again, especially in this specific circumstance, Christie herself wrote the play, right? So she made all of those adaptational decisions herself when she was writing the play based on the book, to change certain things or leave certain things out. For example, perhaps the biggest being the detective of the novel, Hercule Poirot, who's a pretty famous detective. You've probably heard of him. He is not in the play. And I can easily see how reading the text, especially if you're someone who has to really get in there and engage with this script as a text in and of itself, that you really just want to kind of maintain the sanctity almost of that story, of the theatrical story that Christie chose to tell, and not really be influenced by anything on the page, because that was one medium and this is another. So I think that's really interesting. But you were tempted, it sounds like.
Yes, very, very tempted. And I have to tell you, I actually through staging the play and through our rehearsal process, I'm a really big proponent about who the audience plays in the room with the other actors and what character the audience is. And something that I've been focusing on, this is actually a little insight into my process not a lot of people know about, and actually might not be the most clear as an audience member, but what I've chosen to do is actually, as a background, have Poirot be the audience's eye in the play. So he's almost sort of like a ghost character in how I've conceived the staging, and it's sort of like as the 13th sort of member, he's sort of present, at least in our theatrical brain. But of course, I think, as I know you know, Kemper, the inspector and the detective in the play obviously are heavily inspired by Poirot. So that definitely has been an important step in our process, and including him in that way as an inspiration, obviously such a big part of the background and history of the writing. But I still wanted to include his energy sort of in the room. So I think that eye and that sort of 13th character has been a really helpful step in our staging and our process.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you as director, and then and we'll talk a little bit. I know you want to talk about the process by which you kind of figure out, right, how to put on this show with your actors, and it sounds like you make that as collaborative a process as possible. You're conceiving among yourselves that Poirot is actually in the audience and he's watching the proceedings, like a ghostly Poirot presence. I love that. I really
yeah. And I truly hope that fans that come to see the show that really know Poirot and his presence in other of Agatha Christie's works kind of feel that's sort of been my intention through the staging and through everything that we've been working on.
Well, one of the weakest aspects, I think, of the Hollow, the text, the Hollow, the book, is actually the way that Poirot gets shoehorned into the story, which is why it really doesn't surprise me that, I mean, Christie did this with, many more plays other than the Hollow. She really just did not like having Poirot on stage. She thought that he kind of sucked up all the energy, and it was not something that she wanted to do, even though other people who have adapted Poirot stories have certainly kept him on the stage, I think, with great success. But I think that his absence in the proceedings is definitely workable. But then I love the idea of him having a presence anyway, since we all know, or not all, but many audience members, as you said, many people who come to this play are going to be Christie fans and are going to be people who feel that presence, or at least know that he is there in the original story. So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
In terms of the Hollow specifically, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of the play. I mean, I'd love to ask you about weaving together the lighter moments in the play, because this is a show where Lady Anketel in particular has some great one-liners, and then we have this role of Veronica Cray, which is a significant role in the book, but I think much more significant even in the play. She's this really larger than life presence who takes up a lot of the room and a lot of the story, and I think a lot of intrigue in the play. And I think Christie really uses her quite masterfully as a stage presence. So we have those which are kind of bigger, lighter moments, and then those sort of get combined with the darker moments of a murder mystery play. And this one is especially dark. I mean, and I'm thinking of what happens at the end of the play, and you don't have to worry about spoiling anything, by the way. Everyone is on notice that, if they're listening to an episode about the Hollow, that the Hollow itself is going to be spoiled. So feel free to say whatever you'd like. I think Christie pulls it off beautifully in the Hollow, as she does in so many of her other books. Her books often do include lots of humor amidst a grounded murder investigation where horrible things happen. I'm curious, though, if this was a challenge at all when bringing the play to life. And one of the reasons I'm asking this question is that I actually recently read this memoir by a man named Hubert Gregg, who was the first director of the West End production of The Hollow, actually. He talks about this very challenge where I think when they were actually still in rehearsals on it, and even in some of their earliest performances, they were getting laughs that they didn't want and laughs that were kind of puncturing the suspense and the tension. So he talks about actually like how you can actually deliver a line that might sound funny, and you sort of break up the delivery of it so that you don't get a laugh that you might otherwise get, which I thought was really fascinating. There's just like a lot of great little theater geek moments like that in this memoir by Hubert Gregg, which is actually otherwise kind of a nasty memoir because he's not very nice about Agatha Christie as a person. But that was one of the few parts that I thought was really interesting when he was talking about putting on The Hollow. And I just thought about that as I was thinking of our interview today. So I'm just curious in terms of tone and just, joining together those lighter and darker moments, what that's been like for you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're bringing this up. So it's been really interesting in rehearsal, and I'm really collaborative and clear with my actors about this as well. I think the most important thing for a genuine performance is that we're really digging for the truth in the text, in the play, but also the truth as human beings and as actors in the space. So I think with the lighter moments and what sort of jumps off the page as a sort of comedic take, like you mentioned, with Lady Angatel and with a lot of Veronica Cray's speeches, and those moments definitely do feel kind of lighter and sporadic and in place for a change in energy in the space. I think the most important thing as we've been working through is that we're just finding what the truth of it is. And then as long as that is a clear step, then when we get to these big moments, like you'll find, Kemper, when you see the show, we've actually changed the intermissions. So our intermission is going to be after the murder of John Christo. Mm-hmm. And there's only one as opposed to two as a 3-act play.
Yeah.
With that, once we get the moments like the murder of John Christo, obviously the very end of the show with Gerda committing suicide, those moments are also truthful. So actually they all fall under the same umbrella. And I personally don't really lean into anything as like playing it as a comedy moment or playing it as a serious moment. I really am most interested in just looking for the truth in all of it. Mm-hmm. And as you know too, and as I'm sure a lot of viewers have experienced in the writing of Agatha Christie's work, everything so beautifully jumps off the page. So as I've been working through the play, I'm finding that the text is really speaking to me, coming up with staging and coming up with ideas. And I think the actors feel the same way. So as we are collaborating through everything, it's sort of leading us in the right direction of what we need to do. So that's definitely helpful. And I think with the lighter and darker moments throughout the show, that definitely is a really guiding piece in putting everything together.
And I'm curious about that process. You mentioned this collaborative process with your actors. How do you go about blocking a scene, for example? Is that something that you're doing with them as you're getting together and going through a scene? Do you have sort of an overarching suggestion that you begin with and then you make adjustments from there, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we've been sort of using a formula in rehearsal. So basically, we'll start out with addressing any questions from the previous rehearsal in case anything has come up or anybody has any ideas or sort of outside light bulbs to talk about. Then before we started rehearsals, I went through the script with my assistant director, who's also my dramaturg. Her name is Ryan Henry. She's wonderful. And basically, we broke up the script into sections for continuity in the room. So when we start a section in rehearsal, we'll start with breaking down any big adjustments or beat changes within the scene, and then giving it a read through a straight read, and sort of along the lines of what I was just saying. It always seems that in the room, the ideas jump off the page for the actors and I to analyze then after a read of the scene. So that from there, we kind of analyze any questions or diving into character moments. And then I always explain to them, I come in with an idea of blocking based off of that thing that's speaking to me before rehearsal. So then I see how the preparation in the blocking reads after we walk it on its feet, and then we sort of adjust things from there. So sort of taking things in layers, sort of specific to my process, but it seems to be working really well with this piece for sure.
That's really interesting. I mean, it makes sense to me that it would have to be somewhat of a collaborative process because you can't figure out everything until you're all in the space together, right?
Yes, yeah, totally. And it's that thing of an actor might have a different idea than you do going into the space, but both parties being able to be flexible and finding a middle ground. And it sort of goes back to that truth. It's like really digging for the truth, which is, of course, with Agatha Christie's work, but I think that's really any theatrical piece is finding what's genuine and true and uncovering what that is for everybody in the room.
How has it been in terms of the set design of this show? Has that been a particular challenge or, a particular non-challenge? I mean, Christie often, I think she was very aware of the sorts of logistical hurdles that theater companies had to overcome. And she often actually really simplified her locations and her settings for that reason, which is I think, one of the reasons that so many of her plays continue to be produced literally every day, especially in regional and amateur venues, because they tend to be pretty easy to put on. But I'm curious, since this is an off-Broadway production, you've got some juice here to do some interesting things. I'm just curious what the set design process has been like for The Hollow.
Yeah, so actually at Players Theater, it's an interesting space because all of the dressing rooms are off stage left. And offstage right is actually the wall of the theater. And on the other side of that wall is the alleyway. And there's actually not a ton of room to cross upstage. So with our set design and using the space, the sort of living room where we experience and where we see the action in the play, we've chosen to really use the depth of the space so that the most upstage space is going to be where the terrace is. And then offstage left is going to be what Agatha writes in the stage directions as into the house. So anytime a character is exiting into the house, it's always stage left. And then our stage right is offstage. We are referencing using as the breakfast note. And we've actually chosen to put the worshiper offstage right as well. The statue that Henrietta is working on. So we actually primarily, in terms of entrances and exits, we just use offstage left primarily, and then upstage the terrace. And so our set is actually beautifully designed by someone named Liz Cheney, who came in really prepared into our initial meetings with some great ideas. And she's a huge fan of Agatha Christie's work and did great preparation before we started collaborating on furniture and set pieces and placement. And basically, it's a unit that, of course, doesn't move at all throughout the 2-hour play. And the furniture is also, of course, stationary. But what we chose to do for the audience is give a lot of set dressing and things to look at that could potentially be clues, which I find actually in the writing of the play and as we've been uncovering and collaborating in our process, it seems to me that there are a lot of sort of false clues that Agatha purposely puts in to mislead the audience and sort of like it sometimes is a very important piece of information, but a lot of times I actually find is put in place to sort of deter or purposely confuse possibly a viewer. So we kind of are leaning into that and adding a lot of extra things in the space, like, a big herring on one of the bookshelves, a bunch of set dressings on top of the fireplace mantle, extra pieces on, we have a sort of bar table downstage left. So a lot of glasses. So it's almost the idea that anything really could be a murder weapon because we know what's going to happen. So yeah, we've chosen to really lean into that with the set design.
Definitely. And you see that, I think, especially in these plays that Agatha Christie adapted herself. And I remember being struck by that in The Hollow. There is a lot of misdirection in The Hollow. She is, and I kind of alluded to it with Veronica Cray. I think Veronica Cray is such a red herring suspect, especially in the play. And, this is where it's been a while now since I've read The Hollow, the novel, but I just don't remember her being as much of a focus of the novel as she really is in the play. And I think it's because she's a fascinating character to watch. And she has those somewhat ridiculous speeches, and she's just such an object of fascination that I think Christie really plays around with the idea of well, she has to have something to do with this, and she really doesn't. Like she at the end of it, it's just she really was not involved in the murder, and even in I think the relationships that end up being the memorable ones and the key ones. Like, yes, there was a relationship that happened between her and John, but it's John and Henrietta, it's John and Gerda, it's Henrietta and Gerda, Edward and Midge. Like, those all end up being the ones that I think are significant. And I love the fact that Veronica is just kind of like traipsing through this play and saying and doing all sorts of memorable things. But then when you get to the end of it, you realize like most of that really didn't matter, even though it was a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Kemper. I think what's really interesting is when she comes into this space, and we are also leaning to that in this production. When she comes in with guns ablazing, and she's in there. And as soon as she sees John, it is very, very, it's a big moment and a big light bulb moment for her that she is re-experiencing and coming back to all of these things that she's felt in the past. And I definitely agree. I think from somebody that doesn't know the play, that's experiencing it for the first time, she's almost made out to be who is likely the murderess.
Yes.
But I think it's interesting that, again, sort of going back to that truth thing and finding really the truth. Her truth is just sort of coming to fruition about her past relationship with John and what that experience is for her. And that's the reality for her. But of course, we're analyzing a different thing. But putting the puzzle pieces together, it makes it easily look like she could have done it.
Yes. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I think Christie is so clever with the way that she blocks in the script of the play the murder of John Christo, followed by Gerda kind of coming on stage and picking up the gun. And it's very similar to what she's really doing in the novel, where it's one of those moments, and Christie is better at this, I think, than anyone else, where once you're on the other side of it and you know what happened, you can't believe that you didn't, see it for what it was, because she kind of gives you all of the pieces right up front, where it's like she's the first one there. Someone who just dropped a gun can pick it up right after. I should have been able to figure it out. It's this sudden, I always call it the palm on forehead moment, where you're like, how could I not have seen that? How could I have been so stupid? She gave me all the tools to figure this out for myself. But that's got to be really tricky to block in a play. So I just would love to hear about your process for how you figured out what you were going to do with that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it's okay, I'd actually love to share with you exactly what we're doing.
Please do.
So right after the gunshot that we hear that kills John, how I've staged it actually is that moment happens upstage center through two French doors that lead out onto the terrace. So we actually see him get shot from offstage left. Then John stumbles into the space so that he ends up falling onto the floor a little bit further downstage. So around downstage right, downstage center. Then after a moment of him stumbling into the space, we see that the murderer drops the gun upstage center, just an arm. We obviously don't see the person, just an arm drops the gun downstage center. Then how we've collaborated and justified it in the space. And as you mentioned, it's sort of almost a purposely confusing moment, which from a viewer's point of view it takes a second, I think, to process. But how we stage it from there is actually Gerda then enters into the space downstage left. So justifying it by thinking she possibly climbed in a window and then through a room down the hallway and then into the space from like a hallway from the rest of the house. And it's a pretty quick moment. I'd say it's probably about 10 seconds that she would have had to do that. But then we actually see her enter into the space downstage left. And then I believe the line, she says, "John, oh, John." And then she comes running into the space. From there, then I'm having her cross upstage center that she's seeing, that she's looking at the window to see possibly if anybody saw her do it. And then she's picking up the gun from there. And something we sort of analyzed in rehearsal is, well, why, if she did it, I mean, she did do it, but why would she pick up the gun? Because she knows there are going to be fingerprints on it. But I think that's why, because in the back of her head, she knows that they're going to take fingerprints and they're going to find her hand on the gun. And I think it justifies it for her. But I think from experiencing it from the front, it also, again, sort of leading into the false and sort of confusing clues placed throughout the text. I think it sort of helps the audience to experience what it could be if they have the time to connect those dots, and or that it feels like, oh, well, there's no way she could have done it because she came from that direction and not that direction. So it's sort of like both sides of the coin, but that's how we've chosen to stage it for this.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So it's like you added your own little obfuscation by having her arm. And is it the actual actor's arm? Like, is it the actor playing Gerda whose arm you see dropping the gun?
So it's interesting you bring that up. That's something that we did think about including, but what we're actually going to do just for timing and sort of backstage traffic is the arm that we see is going to be our ASM Kelly's arm to drop the gun into the space upstage center. And we sort of see that through a window that by the door in that direction. But the actor is actually just standing downstage left, ready for her entrance.
Right, getting ready for her entrance.
You
said the ASM assistant stage manager, right?
Yeah.
Just in case anyone was like, what's an ASM?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. Well, and that's fair. I mean, as long as it wasn't one of the other characters' arms, that obviously would be, I think, a step too far. That could be potentially misleading. But it's a neutral arm. It's a neutral arm that you see. No, I think that's fair because what Christie is doing in terms of giving a significant clue is just that the first person on the scene is Gerda. So the first person on the scene necessarily, I think, is often the one who was closest. And that's why, when we get to the end, and if a audience member is going to think back to how it played out, they'll realize like, oh yeah, like that sort of makes sense. And then it also makes sense why she would have picked up the gun, as you said. And I think it's why The Hollow is actually one of Christie's novels that is particularly ripe for adaptation, because the murder does happen in situ, as it were, in the text. Like, we actually see the murder play out on the page, and that doesn't happen that often in Christie, actually. Like, usually it's the discovery of a corpse or even just the telling of a murder that happened elsewhere. But to actually see a murder happen before our eyes as readers is unusual in Christie, which is why The Hollow, the novel, is a particularly dramatic novel. It's a tableau. I mentioned this actually when I had a former co-host. Her name is Catherine Brobeck, who hosted the podcast with me when we were ranking all of the novels. She passed away a couple of years ago, so that's why I'm doing
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. That's why I'm doing the podcast now. But I just say that to you because sometimes people get confused. Why are you saying we as opposed to I? But I kind of switch back and forth between the two. But when Catherine and I were covering The Hollow, the novel, I talked about how I believe when I was in fourth grade, we had to do these dioramas, which is like what a lot of elementary school kids have to do. Like you put it in a shoebox where you do like a little dramatic tableau. And my choice of dramatic tableau was the swimming pool murder scene from The Hollow.
Wow, that's amazing.
It just struck me as like you can see it and it's also based on an actual swimming pool. It was actually the swimming pool of the stage actor, the very famous mid-20th century stage actor, Francis L. Sullivan, and his wife. They were friends of Christie's. He had played Poirot on the stage for her, and she would go up to their country estate and they had this swimming pool there. And she very specifically set it at the pool because in her dedication to the novel, she apologizes to them for using their pool as the scene of a murder.
Oh my God. Wow.
But yeah, it's really great to be able to play around with the blocking and the staging in that way, because that's what Christie herself was doing. And then I think she definitely had a lot of fun with that when she was adapting the play herself. And it's just, I'm glad. I mean, you're obviously being so thoughtful about all of these choices that you're making and how that might work. Jumping through a window or like getting into one place really quickly so you can make a different entrance. Like that is totally fair in Christie. I think you're totally within your rights. Yeah, in terms of the choices that you made.
Yeah, and I just want to share too something else that I'm choosing to do with this production is exactly what you just mentioned, which is with the pacing, we're really keeping it pretty quick. So I think with that, it's like it forces the audience to also sort of follow along pretty quickly, and all of those clues, and for the actors justifying those things so that it truly is believable. So I think, yeah, definitely like something we've been really focusing on, especially recently in rehearsal, is the attention to detail and making moments really specific because everything's happening really quickly. And of course, this is my job, is to make sure that the audience is really able to catch it. And so that nothing overlaps too much, that it's too quick to follow, but that it's clear so that by the end of the 2 hours, you're able to really come to a clear assessment of who you think done it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was talking about this in a much more theoretical way with some other guests on the podcast recently, because I did this big episode on the Mousetrap, and I've been kind of considering Christie as a playwright and just the theatrical works of Christie, both, the ones that she adapted herself and then others that are adapted by other people. And a murder mystery on the stage really is a very different thing from a murder mystery on the page. And I think when you're adapting a novel for film or television, it's a lot easier because a lot of the tricks that you can do through narrative voice on the page, you can recreate through the camera, through sort of that narrative lens that you have, because the camera forces your eye to go where it goes, and it can zoom in on things, or it can just sort of choose what you're going to see. But live theater is so different, right? Because everyone is existing in this space as independent people. And it makes a lot of sense to me. And you already mentioned the fact that you think of the audience as a member of the play. They're there with you because everyone is in this space together. And there's this autonomy that I think makes it a lot trickier when you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we stage this murder so that it is baffling, interesting, yet solvable, right? Or, somewhat solvable, right, so that when you get to the end, you don't feel cheated. That you don't want an audience member to sit there and be like, hey, wait a second, there's no way I could have figured that out. But you also don't want to make it too obvious. Like if you had Gerda's hand with like a recognizable ring on it, and then she just stepped out right afterward, like then they'd be like, okay, I know who did that. Like you can't go that far either. So it's like having to, find that balance, that sort of middle area in a play. And I just think it's really tricky. So it takes a lot of care and a sort of conscientious process, like it sounds like you've gone through with your actors and all of the other professionals who are helping you put on this show.
Yeah. And something that just came to mind was actually about who does get murdered with John. And I think something we've been experiencing in the process is what qualities he brings that do and don't feel surprising when he gets murdered. So I think it's what we've chosen to do. And I have a wonderful actor his name is Dustin. And what we've worked on together is sort of John sort of being this grimy presence from the second he comes in. And I think I mentioned earlier, we have a bar table with a lot of liquor on it. So the first thing we see when he comes into the space is he goes and makes himself a drink. And so he's sort of made out to be this sort of mean alcoholic type from the beginning. And then obviously we see how he talks to Gerda from the beginning, which obviously in 2025, I think anybody would recognize that as not okay. Obviously, we're setting the play in 1939, but the experience of how he's talking to her, I think, we see that is something that is not acceptable at this time and something that's really grimy. But we're choosing to really lean into that. So I think with everything you just mentioned, that is definitely something we're painting different people out to be, and sort of circling back to that false clues thing that she had throughout the play. What's important to me is that nothing is too predictable, even especially for people who are experiencing this for the first time and who don't really know the play. That we're not nothing. I'm not staging or leaning into anything is too predictable, but it's almost as though the painting that we're doing with the characters is that there's any possibility that anybody that we're meeting could be the person murdered or could be the murderess or murderer, so that it's in a place that feels organic and not too pushed, but also very possible. And I do totally agree with you about the theatrical sense, and that it is pretty challenging at times to adapt this for a live experience. But I think what Christie does really, really well in the writing is that he puts really clear stage directions, all of which I actually don't observe, but a lot of them really do help, because it helps moment really clearly placed in terms of action and clues that we need to see. There's a moment actually in our Act 2 where we place the intermission, where Midge put gloves down on the mantelpiece stage right, and she leaves them there by accident. And then we see later that Edward sees them on the mantelpiece. And then what I've done is I've staged it with him putting them in his pocket. And the moment that we see later in the play where he goes off stage, gets the gun, and stands by the mantelpiece after Midge has just said that she doesn't want to marry him, that's sort of almost like a moment of like contemplation, life contemplation for him. But that's to say, the gloves and how Agatha has placed them in the stage directions in the script, the gloves being placed down sort of symbolizes that it could be almost like a suicide note or something like that, that are in his pocket. So all that to say, it's just interesting how things are placed and how we justify them as a live experience, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I also wanted to ask you about the sculpture. You referenced it a little earlier in our conversation, because Henrietta is a sculptress, as she's referred to in the novel and the play. And this sculpture that she's working on of Gerda, the worshiper, is sort of an important plot point. It becomes an important plot point because Gerda is our murderer. And I think it really helps explicate who Gerda really is, and also Henrietta's understanding, her unique understanding of Gerda, because I think the relationship between Henrietta and Gerda is one of the things I find so interesting about both the novel and the play, because technically we have a, wronged woman, other woman situation here, but it's so much more complicated and interesting than that between the two of them. And there's a real, I wouldn't say affection, but understanding, especially on Henrietta's side. And Henrietta Savernick is one of my favorite characters. So it's all well and good, of course, for Christie to describe this sculpture and set up Henrietta as an amazing artist, which I think she does quite well in the novel. And I think she's really drawing a parallel, even though she would never admit it because she was so self-deprecating. But I think she's really drawing a parallel between Henrietta and herself when it comes to their art. But you have the unenviable task of actually having some sort of a sculpture on the stage. So what does that look like, and how did you come up with the sculpture itself? And is it a finished sculpture? Because she's sort of working on it. I mean, I'm just curious what the state of the sculpture is in the play and how you brought that to life.
Yeah, so I think for our theatrical adaptation of it, we actually have chosen to make the worshiper a little bit smaller. It's just a logistical thing so it's able to be held and carried onto the stage. But I think the theater in my brain, actually, the worshiper obviously would be a much larger piece.
Yes, it's very big in my mind as well. I don't know if that's because Christie describes it that way, but I think of it as this sort of almost oppressive presence, actually.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think the hard thing with our staging is that we see Gerda drop it. And I think that's a moment that's kind of hard on the stage. And and then it becomes something, with our run, we don't want the piece to break, and then we have to have a bunch of backups. It's more logistical, the reason why we've chosen for it to be smaller. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely interesting to note the presence, because it really is, it almost becomes a 14th character if we're including the audience as a 13th character, because it's sort of like the all-knowing fly on the wall that's there the whole time in the space. And what's also interesting, and I think this is sort of unique to our adaptation of this version of the play, is that the piece that she's working on at the very, very top of the show, with how the plays start, we've chosen to put it on a pedestal on the terrace, which we see through a window, and it actually stays there the whole time. So it's what we see. This is sort of like upstage left through the window, is we see an unfinished piece that Henrietta is working on. And the only time we see her working on it is at the very top of the show. And then we see a different piece that is finished on stage, sort of off to the stage left side. And then the worshiper sort of lives off stage right. So, there are definitely, at least my intention and my hope was including all of this artwork. And as you mentioned, obviously, is very important to Christie as well, that sort of sense is always in the space. And Henrietta's presence and her work is always available to what we see.
I'd love to know whether you had any struggles in terms of what I've come to call depictions stuck in their time on the podcast. In the book, The Hollow, there are a few, unfortunately, striking instances of anti-Semitism on the page in the description and the depiction of Midge's boss, for example. I will be honest with you, it's actually been a while since I read the play, and I have never seen the play. Hopefully, I will be able to see your production of the play. So it's not top of mind how toned down these references might be in the play. I mean, I know we certainly don't see Midge at work, for instance, in the play. Like we're remaining at the estate. But I'm curious if there were any sorts of challenges with depictions of this nature regarding anti-Semitism or anything else in a play that was written not quite a century ago, but we're getting close. A play that was written decades upon decades ago. I wondered if you struggled with anything within the text of the play in that way.
Yeah, so I think, to be honest, it never really dawned on me really in the room And I did get a sense of it, but I think subconsciously what we chose to do specifically with that moment with Midge is because it around and during a phone call that she has, how we have the phone call stage actually is it's written in the play, in the text, as a full conversation that we hear the other side of the conversation, but we actually just have her one side of the conversation. So we don't hear anything else from the phone. So I think subconsciously what that decision might be is as to not isolate the audience or the actor, because it is something, you're right, it's something that feels definitely stuck in its time, not necessarily relevant to how we are acting and what we're doing in 2024. But yeah, I think that decision definitely was made to sort of, I don't want to say to avoid the conflict of the situation, but I think also considering the payoff of that in that moment and the intention of what's happening in the scene isn't about that, if that makes sense. It's, we're leading to something else. So I think that underlying sort of anti-Semitism is not something that we really necessarily need to be focusing on. So I hope and I think that without really leaning too far into it, we've made a good decision in terms of not isolating the experience of the audience and hopefully the actor as well.
Yeah. I think in The Hollow, the anti-Semitism lifts out easily. Not to be flippant about it, but it kind of does, because it really is. It's in that moment, and it's sort of a means to an end, just to convey where Midge is and the fact that she, is not as well off and has this sort of pride as to where she is in her life. And it's like it's a little bit of an obstacle in terms of her burgeoning relationship, right, with Edward. And you don't necessarily need that. There's certainly, I think there are other ways that Christie conveys the same thing already in the play. So it's not something that you need to dwell on.
Right, exactly. And I always, whenever I'm working through text with the actors and whenever we're analyzing a certain section, we're always kind of coming to the core of what are we trying to say here and what's the point of this? And I think while at the time this was written, that obviously was a really big experience, I don't think the message that we're trying to say really leans too far into that, if that makes sense. So I agree, not to be flippant about it at all, but I think hopefully that staging of how this is referenced in context is something that definitely is helpful for that point.
Is there anything about the play that you wanted to change or do differently from what was on the page? Were there any instances where you were, really found yourself pushing back hard on something that Christie had done?
Yeah, I think something that I kind of have taken a lot of time to work through is Sir Henry and his points of view on Lady Engatel. Something that I think could be interesting to explore in a sort of edited version of the script. Obviously, not to change Agatha Christie's brilliant work, but I think something that I sort of have struggled through justifying is how he really does not like Lady Engatel, and they're married. It's tumultuous and it's really negative, and that's something that I personally don't love about their relationship. But I think in context of a whodunit and we're thinking and looking for a murderer, I think that does help the audience in what he says and how he feels about her. And I think that it definitely leans into that. But I think it's the sensitive side of me that doesn't love that he sort of is a little misogynistic in that way and his point of view about her. And that's really the only thing I wish I could change. And I think in a different theater and a different production, I would also be interested in staging it in a different time period. I think that could be really interesting as well. But we tried to stay really genuine with this. I think I said earlier we're setting it in 1939, so it's just going into the 40s. The play was released, I think, in 1951, if I'm not mistaken. So I wanted it to sort of be a genuine experience to when it came out and when it originally played as well. And we had a wonderful dramaturg help us with our history behind all of it. So it hopefully feels like a genuine actions and a genuine background to the actors. But yeah, I think in a different production, I would be really interested in setting it not in current time, maybe even a little bit later in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny to me that you chose 1939, which, you know, the David Suchet Poirot series, which is so beloved among many Christie fans, they quite famously, infamously for a few people, but famously for most people, chose to set almost all of their adaptations of her Poirot stories in the mid 30s. Let's, you know, in and around 1934 to 1936, with major exceptions for certain adaptations. But there's something about that period that I think feels like a core kind of era when it comes to just the era of golden age detective fiction and classic crime. And Christie had this glut of Poirot novels that she wrote all in a row in the 1930s. And I think in that the golden age is said to be between the two world wars. The 1930s just feels like the sweet spot. So it's interesting that you kind of chose, you know, right in that sweet spot just a couple of years later in 1939. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I have to ask, you know, given that you have put on so much musical theater, first, this is sort of a two-part question. Have you put on any mystery plays before? And if so, I'm curious how that experience compares to the experience of putting on The Hollow. But then I'm also just curious how this experience of putting on a non-sung, non-danced, spoken murder mystery play of Agatha Christie's, how that compares to all the musical theater that you've done. I mean, there are obvious differences, but I'm also very curious to hear about the similarities as well.
So I have to be honest, Kemper, and this is actually a big secret I'm about to reveal. I have actually never directed a straight play before this.
Wow.
I've only ever directed musicals and choreographed musicals. So this is a really great question because with my background and how I've approached this production is through a lot of physical movement through space. Of course, that's not to say dance, but it's bodies in space and relationships in space. And of course, focusing, it's sort of all with a straight play or a musical, in my opinion, it's really one and the same. I mean, it's just that one happens to have singing and dancing and the other doesn't. And
right.
But it's all the same sort of basis of storytelling with the actors in collaboration with the actors. It's the same. But I think in terms of staging, the difference in staging is actually I think what you'll see when you see this production is that I've tried to really use the space and move everything with sense of the text and with different parts of the stage sort of representing a different emotion or a different experience of where the characters are in that given scene. But yeah, I think having a strong musical background and having a strong dance background has definitely helped because in this play we see so much movement and we see so many clues that have to be specific. And in a way, it almost is choreographed in that we need to catch and see things at specific moments. And of course, nothing has count, but I think that definitely has helped, and that feels like a nice arc to what the audience is experiencing in the moment. And also, I meant to say this earlier, just to share with you and also the fans listening, we actually have included a lot of original music that's going to be underscoring throughout this play. And also sound effects like the telephone ringing. We actually do have a percussionist that's going to be in the pit of the theater that's going to be playing almost like movie underscoring throughout the play. So that through a lot of transitions of characters entering and exiting, underneath some more dramatic exchanges and throughout the play and different sound effects, and even in and out of sections, like, you know, as we go through the Friday afternoon, Saturday morning, all the different sections of the play will have will have original underscore music. And just a little fun fact, our percussionist is actually the owner of the theater. His name is Michael. And he's brilliant. He went to Juilliard and he's really, really great. So that's definitely another thing that's going to be really, really interesting for this version. And again, not to say nothing is really going to be choreographed to that. And I think it will just help move the story along and give a nice sense of tone in experiencing the play. But that definitely is something that I think is going to be pretty original to this version.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, blocking is just choreography by another name, right? And there's a physicality to any production, be it a musical or a straight play. And I think, as we've discussed, the physicality of a murder mystery play is of particular importance. So, I mean, in a way, I think if you have exclusively a musical theater and dance background, the best straight play to do is probably a mystery play, because I think the physicality is of utmost importance in a mystery play, even compared to something that might be more straightforwardly dramatic, because it's so important where these bodies are and that, where they go in relation to each other is dead on and sort of choreographed, like you said, and that it all makes sense and that it's all in service of telling the story, which is exactly what you're doing in a musical. I mean, the bodies are in motion, and it's ultimately in service of telling whatever story that musical number is telling. It's usually part of the narrative. I mean, ever since Oklahoma, right? Songs are kind of advancing the narrative. So you're sort of doing the same thing here. And that's really, really interesting to me. And I think that's exciting that you're bringing that expertise to bear on an Agatha Christie play. And I love the idea of those sound effects being live. It's sort of like like in a silent movie theater or something, right? Where there used to be the orchestra playing underneath, and that would kind of like bring that sort of live theater aspect to something that you were still watching on film. So that's really, really cool. Well, I just wanted to ask you, as someone who is a theater person, and now you're putting on your first straight play, your first Agatha Christie. I mean, I referenced the fact that Agatha Christie plays just continue to be put on a near daily basis, especially in more regional and amateur venues, but also on Broadway and in the West End and on off-Broadway, and just, in all sorts of venues, literally all over the world, not even just the English-speaking world. Having now worked on The Hollow for the past couple of months, and you're getting close to actually bringing in audiences, and I'm wondering if you have any sort of a perspective on why Christie is as enduringly popular in the theater as she is.
Yes, I have a really straightforward and pretty easy answer to that question. There have hardly been any questions in our experience putting this production up by the actors, because it's so clearly written. And I think that is why people connect so deeply with Christie's work in general, is because it's easy to understand, it's easy to experience, and it's easy to relate to in personal experiences. And it's almost, when she wrote all of this is just my opinion, I think she was really ahead of her time. And how she was sharing all of this storytelling and how relatable these things are to people's experiences. And that's why I feel like it's a worldwide phenomenon, in my opinion.
I love that. There's a truth that she accesses to who these people are, for both good and bad, and she never shies away from the bad. And that is something that is very much true for the novels as well. But I think for The Hollow specifically, the insight into character and human nature that she showcases in this story, certainly in the novel, but I think also in the play, it's one of her very best for that. And I think, like you're saying, it's hard not to be moved by that as a reader, and hopefully as a viewer, as an audience member in your upcoming production. I have no doubt after this conversation that people will be moved in the seats, and perhaps there will be a little ghostly Poirot hovering above them who will move them.
Exactly.
Well.
Just look over your shoulder. Yeah.
Well, Andrew Winans, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I know that you are very busy right now because you really are in the final days leading up to this production. There are a million little things to do, I'm sure. And I really appreciate that you took the time to talk to me and share some of your insight and your passion into bringing this Agatha Christie production to life. I guess I should say break a leg for the upcoming show.
Thanks for having me, Kemper. And just to share, I really appreciate your podcast, and I appreciate all you do to support really the legacy of this. It's an incredible experience as a reader, and I think as a theatrical viewer or as a film or TV viewer watching this work, it's really great. And your podcast really actually helped me a lot in pre-production. So thank you. Thank you for having
that's
me.
Wonderful. Thrilled to hear that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you again to Andrew Winans, director of The Hollow. It was so clear to me in our conversation how deeply he has thought about the best way to bring this Agatha Christie play to the stage, and I cannot wait to watch it for myself. In particular, I love that point he made about the choreography required in a murder mystery. That really spoke to me as a lover of both musical theater and murder mystery plays. I encourage anyone who can to check out the show, attend a performance. Again, you can click on the link to the Players Theater that I've provided in the notes. For next week's episode, as I mentioned up top, I am going to be sharing with you a live episode. It's not going to be streamed live, but it will be a live recording of one of my book events that I'm doing next week. When I go to Schuler Books in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I am going to be having a conversation with one of the booksellers there at Schuler Books that I will be bringing to you as a live episode of the podcast. We are going to talk The Busybody. We're going to talk Agatha Christie and mystery. And this is a great way for me to just talk substantively about what I did when I wrote The Busybody vis-a-vis everything that Catherine and I did on this podcast, studying Agatha Christie as closely as we did. Many of you have asked me questions about that, how that process worked. And short of having an interview with myself, I figured this was a great way to share that process with you all. So I'm very excited to bring you that episode next time. And of course, in the meantime, you could always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page for bonus content. For the month of April, I covered Overture to Death by Ngaio Marsh, which I really enjoyed. I had lots of thoughts about it, and many of you patrons had lots of thoughts as well. I'm so glad that I read this Ngaio Marsh novel. So if you are a Ngaio Marsh fan, you might want to check that out. Or if you've always meant to read a Ngaio Marsh, may I suggest that you start with Overture to Death? Click on the link in the notes. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me at Kemper Donovan Books. And as I mentioned up top, I've included a link in the notes to my ongoing book tour, and I encourage everybody who can to come on out and attend one of those events and to say hello. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you in person. And as always, I would appreciate a rating and or a review for this podcast. Every rating, every review we get makes it easier for other Christie fans and mystery fans to find this podcast and to grow this community that Catherine and I have built here over the years, which is a community I truly love and cherish. So thank you in advance for helping me to continue to grow that community. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Grand Canyon University, an affordable private Christian university, is one of the largest and fastest growing universities in the country, offering more than 270 programs online. In addition to federal grants and aid, GCU's online students received nearly $130 million in institutional scholarships in 2022. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu/myoffer to see the scholarships you may qualify for.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.